Welcome everyone to this final session of what has been a very fruitful and intense 3 days. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come for about half of it because I had to teach. And I would like to begin by thanking the organization committee, my dear friend Abed and Ali, for inviting me to chair this very illustrious session. On my left, I have Professor Akshin Somel, who was my student some years ago. We won't talk about how many years ago. And even then, he was brilliant. He was already clear that he was brilliant. And since then, he has gone on. He has gone on from strength to strength. He is now an associate professor at Sabancı University. Everyone knows his major works. Again, I'm afraid I'm not like Samir. I can't wave the pages in the air. I haven't done my homework like him. Anyway, Ottoman education policies is his forte. 2 books, but major books. One of them they've both become classics. Public Education in the Ottoman Empire, Islamizing, Autocracy and Discipline. This again is another classic, and little article that nobody knows, but I liked a lot, on the Shparataks. The Shparataks are this obscure Albanian tribe who changed religions like 3 times. On my right, again, a star in his field, Professor Michael Provence, Associate Professor of History at UC San Diego, again an author of a classic book, The Great Syrian Revolt, published 2005, Arabic edition 2012. Very rare to get your book very difficult to get your book translated into Arabic, by the way. So he did a great job. And then, again, his latest work, which hot off the press, to my shame, I haven't seen it yet, The Last Ottoman Generation and the Making of the Modern Middle East, came out just this last spring. And also, I would like to finish by welcoming my dear friend and my hoja, Engin Akarlı. Thanks. It's because of him that I became an Ottomanist, so you have him to blame. Thank you. We have 25, maximum 30 minutes for each paper. We will take questions after both papers. Thank you. And I give the floor to Akshin.
Thank you so much, Hocam, for this very generous presenting me, which I do not really deserve. I would like to thank the American University of Beirut and Professor Abdurrahim Abu Hussein, the Yunus Emre Vakfı Enstitüsü, and Cengiz Bey, and also Mehmet Ali Neyzi for this brilliant organization. Yes. And for this superb organization and this great hospitality. And when Professor Abdurrahim Abu Hussein 1 year before suggested me to join this conference, I said, wow, I would like. But however, I'm a specialist on the 19th century. So what can I do? This is a kind of a 16th century phenomenon. So I thought that I must find some subject, something that I should fit in somehow and come to this conference. Then I thought I worked on Ottoman education for some time, so I could think I could perhaps deliver a presentation, a modest presentation on Ottoman textbooks in the 19th century, history textbooks, and how this 1516, 1517 event was. How the reflection was there on these books. But then I realized that, you cannot say anything meaningful without making a kind of a comparison with the previous periods, previous eras. So I was somehow forced to go back to 16th century, where, although I'm not a specialist on the 16th century, I had to look at from the 1520 onwards. I tried to look at the major historiographical works of that period, and I tried to look at the 17th, 18th century, and then comparing this to see how the perceptions were in the 19th and early 20th century. So, the title, Late Ottoman Perceptions, actually the title is a little bit different now. It should be perhaps a kind of a comparative Ottoman perceptions of Selim's campaign of 1516, 1517. But I beg your pardon, I'm really not a specialist on the Ottoman classical period, and so therefore I may do some mistakes, and there may be some sources which I do not know. In fact, when I was talking about this subject with Professor Firdun Emircan, he reminded me about some certain sources, certain books which did not occur to me to consult. So please beg my pardon. So this is Ottoman perceptions of Selim's campaign, 1516, 1517. So, in fact, yeah, what I try to do is actually to look in terms of the following questions: reasons and motivations for the campaign, legitimizing arguments for the campaign, importance and consequences of the conquests, religious and political symbolism in the narratives, policies and measures in conquered lands, image impression of Selim and Ottomans, and image impression of Kansu Gavri, Tumanbay, and the Mamluks in the historiography, which has changed from the 16th century down to the early 20th century. So, I mean, a lot of things came out, but it is possible to say that there emerged, I mean, there appear to be certain patterns of historical perception, and which changes to some extent from the 16th century down to the early 20th century. But we should keep in mind that I should warn you that all the things which I will mention, these are all perceptions. I mean, these are not hard facts. These are not hard facts. These are all perceptions. So it's about, I mean, this presentation is really only about the perceptions. Okay, for the 16th century, when I began to look who are the historians, I mean, the historians or the authors who dealt with history are, whom I consulted was İdris Bitlisi, Selim Şahname, Hadidi Tevari Ali Osman, Şükrü Bitlisi Selimname, Muhittin Cemalis Tevari Ali Osman, Lütfi Paşas Tevari Ali Osman. I repeated Idris Bitlisi's Selim Şahname because, I mean, although Idris Bitlisi was a very close advisor to Selim I, I mean, his accounts, he was himself directly, he was a witness of all the developments. However, I mean, before he could, to refine his draft, he died, okay? He died, and then much later, his son, Ebu Fazıl Muhammed, completed the draft in 1567. So when his son completed the draft, there are certain elements, certain ideological elements, which apparently do not fit to the 1520s. There has been some changes. I mean, his son, in a sense, in certain aspects, reflects the changing mood, ideological mood in the second half of the 16th century. So I mentioned Idris Bitlisi's here for the second time. I'm representing the second half of the 16th century. Then Küçük Nişancı Mehmet Paşa's Tarihi Nişancı, Mehmet Zaim's Cami-ü Tevarih, Şemsi Ahmet Paşa's Şehname-i Sultan Murad, Hoca Saadettin Efendi's Tacü Tevarih, and Gelibolu Mustafa Ali's Künhül Ahbar. Actually, these are the sources which I have consulted, but for example, I was not able to consult Celalzade Salih's, for example, Tarihi Mısır Cedid, for example. This is something missing in this paper. But however, I can say that, I mean, all these different sources, they reflect a certain pattern of understanding of what happened in the 16th century during the Selim's campaign. What makes these sources also important is that, I mean, these were, in the case of Idris Bitlisi, I mean, they were either eyewitnesses or at least, I mean, as late as Gelibolu Mustafa Ali, they wrote things on the basis of eyewitnesses. So, I mean, they acted to a certain extent as oral historians, or it may be a little bit anachronistic to call that term because it's I mean, of course, there was not a kind of a real critical approach, but I mean, they recorded what eyewitnesses really saw. So therefore, the 16th century sources and their perception is a kind of could be considered as a sort of a scale for later centuries, perceptions of later centuries. So how can we summarize their perceptions? First of all, what we see is that Selim's military action against the Mamluks was not so predetermined as it appears to be much later. I mean, from most of these sources, what we see is that, Selim initially was aimed to first to move to Iran, but then there emerged a crisis with the Mamluks in terms of the crossing the bridge, crossing the Euphrates and the Malatya territories which belonged to the Mamluks, or the accusation of the Ottomans that Kansu Garbi was in correspondence with the heretical Safavids, or the fact that the Kansu Garbi treated the Ottoman ambassadors Karaca Pasha and Zeyrekzade quite badly. So these are the different motives appearing. But what is the common is that Selim actually wanted to move towards Iran, but the crisis with the Mamluks changed the direction of the campaign. Again, from these 16th century perceptions, we see that at Damascus, after the victory at Majdabak, when Selim reached Damascus and settled his winter quarters, they were still indecisive whether to continue the campaign or not. And even later on, when Selim began to move towards the Gaza, close to the Sinai Desert, again he sent an envoy to Tumanbay offering peace with certain preconditions, which, while keeping Tumanbay in power, would incorporate Egypt into the Ottoman realm in a kind of a symbolic way. So all these show that Selim was not so much he was not very much so determined to conquer Egypt. In terms of legitimacy, illegitimacy issues, we get the impression from the 16th century perceptions that the Mamluk Circassian rule over Egypt and Bilad Sham was really illegitimate. They were either oppressive, unjust, or they were characterized by arrogance. They were acting arrogant towards the local population, or they lacked noble blood. It means that they were of slave origins, or they acted together with the Shiite heretics. What is quite striking, according to me, is that there is a kind of a religious symbolism which is very much related to Abrahamic traditions. For example, in all these 16th century sources, we see that Prophet Dawood's grave or Makam was located in Majdabak. This is very much underlined. Or Selim's visits to the tombs of Abrahamic prophets and saints. Enbiya Evliya in Jerusalem and Hebron. This is very much mentioned, and how Selim distributed huge amounts of money to the local churches, to the synagogues, etc., to the different Christian and Jewish communities in that area. Or the characterization of Egypt as the throne of Joseph. Egypt has been always has been understood in terms of the metaphor throne of Joseph. Or, for example, the comparison of Tumanbay with the biblical pharaoh. So while Selim is in the position of, for example, in the position of Moses, Tumanbay is the pharaoh. So it's very much biblical, pre-Islamic biblical notions, as we see. So this is something very striking. Also, these texts seem to be quite honest, because they described in a very open manner the harsh measures and even massacres committed by Selim, such as the events in Ramle or in Gaza, as well as the suppression of the insurgency in Cairo, the 3 days insurgency, but again, we had a lot of discussions which were initiated first by Feridun Emecan, then by Zishan Hanım, then also this morning we had Tufan Buspınar about the issue of caliphate. In the 16th century perceptions, there's not any word about the caliphate in these texts. However, After 1570, we see the emergence of a new motive, which did not exist previously, and this is the idea that Selim aimed to conquer the Arab lands, to acquire the honor, to serve the two holy mosques. At that time, the term Hadimu Harameyn-i Şerifeyn does not occur in the text, but the honor to serve, Harameyn-i Şerifeyn'e hizmet etmek, in this type of expression. So this is in a sense the kind of a scale which on that basis I made my comparisons with the later centuries. When we come to the 17th and 18th centuries, we see in terms of historiography certain changes. First of all, I would like again to show the sources which I have consulted. One is Nishancızade Muhittin Mehmet, Miratül Kainat. The second is Mehmet Ali Rumi Edirnevi's Nuhbetül Tevarih vel Ahbar. Then we have Katip Çelebi's Fezleketül Tevarih. Then we have Solakzade Mehmet Hemdemi's Tarihi Solakzade. Then we have Karaçelebizade Abdülaziz Efendi's Ravzatül Ebraril Mübinil Hakaykil Ahbar. And then we have the Katip Çelebi's Turkish translation from the original Arabic Fezleketül Tevarih, the Turkish summary of Takvim-ü Tevarih. And then Herzafar Hüseyin Efendi's Tenkitü Tevarih-i Müluk. Müneccimbaşı Ahmet Dede Efendi's Sahifül Ahbar, this is the Turkish version of the Cami-ü Düvel. Osmanzade Ahmet Tayyip's Hadikatül Müluk, Şemdanzade Fındıklı Hüseyin Efendi Merü Tevarih. So these are the sources which I have consulted for the 17th and 18th centuries. But I have to say that it is first there's something which I should include. Which I have forgotten to say. I haven't consulted the Vakay Nüvis, the court historians' chronicles, because they relate about the time they lived. However, here in this case, what I have looked are either general Ottoman histories or universal histories, but not those Vakaynames which belong, let's say, Naima's history. It belongs to the time which began from 1656 down to 1716. So these are mainly general histories, but these are not the Vakaynames or the court chronicles histories. So what do you see? I mean, these are mostly, I must say, a kind of a careless copy-paste versions of the 16th century works. I mean, we see a kind of a clear decline in terms of the quality of what has been told. It is really much of a kind of a copy-paste version of production. And there's a kind of also carelessness about being careful about the factual accuracy in terms of information. But there are two notable exceptions. Two notable exceptions. One is Solakzade Mehmet Hemdemi, Tarihi Solakzade, which is really, I mean, among these other sources, he appears to be really, I mean, to have done a good job in terms of being careful, consulting the 16th century sources in a very, very careful way. And second is Katip Çelebi's Fezleketül Tevarih. Katip Çelebi's Fezleketül Tevarih is probably the first really scientific in positivist and in terms of experimental sense, the first text we encountered here in all these accounts where supernatural actors or religious forces do not play any part in historical events. Events are described in we can say in a modern sense, where all the actions are very much connected to in terms of rational choices, rational causalities. So therefore, Katip Çelebi's Fezleketül Tevarih is considered to be the first modern historical work among the others. Another very striking exception is Evliya Çelebi. Evliya Çelebi's Seyahatnamesi, and he's probably the only original source among the 17th and 18th century sources, because Evliya Çelebi in his 9th and 10th book, I mean, these describe his travels to Syria, to Palestine, in the 9th book. In the 10th book, the 10th book includes Egypt and Sudan and Bilad Habesh. There, Evliya Çelebi has recorded local traditions about how the local people remembered Selim's campaign of Mercidabık and Ridaniye, and how was Selim perceived by the local population. The memory, that's what he has recorded in his Seyahatname. So Evliya Çelebi's Seyahatname is therefore quite valuable. So what do we get in terms of the perceptions in the 17th and 18th century? First of all, in the 17th and 18th century, we see that the issue of the custodianship of the two holy mosques, Hadimül Harameyn Şerifeyn, it becomes a standard historiographical theme. It becomes something very much standard. Second, we see a major change in historical outlook. As I said, in the 16th century, it was quite unclear among the historians whether, in terms of Selim's aims, really from the beginning to conquer Egypt. However, in the 17th and 18th century historiographical works, I mean, there's this impression that Selim from the beginning was very, very clearly determined to conquer Bilad-ı-Şam, Egypt, and acquire the title of Hadimül Harameyn Şerifeyn. And here we see the notion that Selim aimed to unify the core Islamic lands. He aimed to unify the core Islamic lands, so he had a kind of an aim to really to create a kind of a unified Islamic empire. And what is also very interesting is that in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Abrahamic elements of religious symbolism, it disappears. It's completely or nearly disappears. But however, there's one exception, and this is Evliya Çelebi. I mean, if you look at Evliya Çelebi's 9th and 10th books, there's still some remnants of these Abrahamic religious symbolism, or the people mention this, the grave of Abraham, of Dawood, and Selim's visits, etc. But in historiography in general, this disappears. So when we come to the 19th and early 20th centuries, we can say that there's a kind of a growing pluralization in outlook, because I mean the Tanzimat period represents a time the young Ottoman movement, and with Namık Kemal, has a totally different outlook. The reign of Abdülhamit is a time which in a sense is a kind of a repetition of the Tanzimat period outlook. And then we have the Young Turk period. The Young Turk period itself consists of different outlooks. So how much time do we have?
12 minutes.
12 months, okay. So I try to be as quick as possible. So for the 19th century, the main sources which I have consulted are Mehmet Şemi's Esmaül Hadaik. Okay, this was published in 1851. The second is Hayrullah Efendi Tarihi, Tarihi Devleti Aliye Osmaniye. This is a huge 16-volume work. Then, in terms of the Tanzimat era, Tanzimat historiography, we have Mehmet Masar Fevzi's Haber-i Sahih, 8 volumes. Then we have Tayyarzade Ata, Tarihi Ata for 5 volumes. And then we have as the late Tanzimat guy, Mansurizade Mustafa Nuri Pasha's Netavcül Vukuat in 4 volumes. Namık Kemal, although he wrote it during the Tanzimat era, he represents a totally different outlook. He was one of the main ideologues of the young Ottoman movement. So here first I will discuss in detail Hayrullah Efendi's Tarihi Devleti Aliye Osmaniye. This is quite an important work in terms of creating a new historiographical shablon for the later generations, actually. In fact, it was Hayrullah Efendi's Tarihi Devleti Aliye Osmaniye which created a kind of outlook which would to more or less extent would be continued, would be followed by later historians of the Ottoman times. So, what do we see in Hayrullah Efendi? First of all, the delivery of the sacred relics, the emanat-ı mukaddese, to Selim in Egypt. Okay, this is something which I did not encounter in previous historiographical texts. Perhaps it existed. Perhaps Feridun Emircan will correct me. I don't know. But I mean, the notion of the delivery of the sacred relics to Selim in Egypt, according to Hayrullah Efendi, it provided the transfer of the caliphate from the Abbasids to the Ottoman dynasty. And this is something. It appears to be in terms of General Tevarih-i Ali Osmani, series of historical graphical works, or in terms of universalistic works, it looks like a novelty. The transfer of the caliphate to the Ottoman Sultan, which under the Mamluks had nominal power, which then provide the caliph actual political power. This is again something which we, in terms of historiography, which seems to be very, it's a kind of like a novelty. Again, Selim was right from the beginning. He was determined to destroy the Mamluk Empire and conquer Egypt. And Selim aimed at unifying the Sultanate of world Muslims under his own authority. But very, very interestingly, with the Tanzimat period, we can encounter now a different approach. And this is a growing uneasiness about the massacres Selim committed at different locations during the campaign. I mean, it means, what I mean is the events at Ramle, the events at Gaza, and the massacres at the Cairo during these 3 days events following the Ridaniya War. So there's a kind of uneasiness which may be related to the Tanzimat reforms, the growing notion of human rights, the notion of ırz, can ve mal güvenliği, emniyeti, the aim to create a kind of a Rechtsstaat, a kind of a rule of law, etc. So it's during the Tanzimat era there's a kind of growing uneasiness about Selim's actions. So the other author, which is interesting, is Mehmet Masar Fevzi. There, actually, he has, in contrast to Hayrullah Efendi, he states that Selim's original aim was actually to move to Iran and to destroy the Shiite Safavid state. However, later on, actually, later he became determined to move to Egypt, and. Again, it was Mehmet Masar Fevzi. He claimed that while Selim aimed to attack Iran, his aim was actually not only to destroy the heretical Shiites, but also to provide the unification of the Muslim millet around the globe. And again, Mehmet Masar Fevzi, he's uneasy about the massacres committed by Selim. And here, but we see, together with the growing young Ottoman movement, the adoption of a new patriotic language, which is attributed to Selim and his army, the qualities of heroism, kahramanlık, and bahadırlık. This becomes more and more kind of a patriotic language, which is still expressed in terms of Islamism or Ottomanism, but then in the second constitutional period, during the Young Turk period, it becomes a part of the Turkish nationalism. So there's a kind of a shift, a kind of a transformation of outlook there. So I don't have much time, but I will shorten my presentation by two notable guys. One is Mansurizade Mustafa Nuri Pasha. And the other guy is the second constitutional period historian. Mehmet Murat, Mizancı Murat, Tarihi Ebul Faruk, Tarihi Osmani'de siyaset ve medeniyet itibariyle Hikmet-i Asliye Taharrisine teşebbüs. Now these two authors, I mean Mehmet Murat, who was a former young Turk, and Mustafa Nuri Pasha, Mansurizade Mustafa Nuri Pasha, these are the two authors who were really critical about Selim. Actually, they considered in religious terms, in Islamic terms, as inhuman what Selim inflicted in Gaza, in Ramle, and in Cairo. Actually, Mansurizade Mustafa Nuri Pasha relates even about certain views of the ulama who stated that I should show, yeah, that's sorry, I should find 5 dakika. Okay, yeah. I didn't put it there, but what Mansurizade Mustafa Nuri Pasha says that, I mean, he's basing it on the contemporary ulama. He says that it would be much more preferable if just one Christian peasant would be converted to Islam, or one Christian village would be conquered, instead of killing thousands and thousands of Muslim blood. So I will finish my presentation here. That's enough.
Okay, we are going to take questions for both of the speakers afterwards, so I now give the floor to Professor Provence.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction, Professor Deringel. I want to say thank you first and very sincerely to my friends Abdurrahim and Alexis and Mehmet Ali for the generous invitation and the lovely conference, and especially for permitting the intrusion of a modern historian in this early modern event. I don't belong, actually, and so it's an especial honor to be able to. But unlike Action, I didn't go back and look at old sources, so I'm a bit sheepish about this. This talk is based on petitions from the League of Nations in the 1920s and 30s, and the changing orientation exhibited in those petitions towards the Ottoman state. Now, after 3 successful days of a wonderful conference, the most important thing, I'm last and least, the most important thing is to be brief. So I'm going to be as short and as brief as possible, because I don't want to try your patience at all after these 3 days. It's absolutely the most important thing, I'm sure. Between 1920 and the 1960s, the Ottoman past in the Arab countries came to be seen as a period of occupation like more recent colonial occupations. And yet, it's clear that in 1914, before the Great War, few, if anyone, thought of Ottoman rule as an imperialist occupation. There may be a few exceptions, but they're slight exceptions. So the title of the talk is, From Whence Came 400 Years of Turkish Occupation, which of course is a reference to the usual Arab nationalist trope common in high school curriculum textbooks in most of the countries of the region. Or to put it another way, who erased 400 years of shared social, political, and economic life, Ottoman economic life in Bilad al-Sham? It's a tragic story, I'm afraid, this period that I'm talking about, and so I apologize for that. It's a bit unfortunate to leave with a tragic story after 3 glorious days, but so be it. Now, there's many possible answers to the question of this, what became of this shared past and its memory. Some possible answers are the trauma of the First World War, the famine, the Safarbarlik, the tyranny and misrule of Jamal Pasha in Damascus and Alais. But something that I like to do, and I confess, is to sometimes imagine conversations with great historians of the past. And when I think of the imaginary conversations I might have with great historians of the past, many of them are AUB historians. And so I was thinking of asking Zain about this, where came 400 years of Turkish occupation. And I was thinking about asking other great historians of AUB what they might say, like Asad Rustam or Nicolasiade. And I thought that they would probably say, well, events gave us 400 years of Turkish occupation, and a changing scene, and the people of the time were people trapped between seismic forces beyond their control, and this international scene was merciless to their aspirations and their feelings and their hopes of this period of the 1920s and 30s. And this is why I say it's a tragic story. So some initial assumptions then. Ottoman state elites in this period before the Great War were educated in the same state civil system or military system and shared a linguistic and cultural identity without regard to their place of origin or mother tongue, whether they were from the Arab regions or Bulgaria or the Circassians or the Balkans or any number of places, Yemen, for example. And the post-war settlement imposed it explicitly denied the possibility of this cosmopolitan Ottoman self-representation. The possibility for that to exist was foreclosed permanently for everyone. And it was no longer possible to represent or to act as a state servant, as a civil servant of a Muslim-dominated imperial system. This was finished. So today it's 400 years from 1516, but it's 100 years from the Sykes-Picot Accord in 1916. And the League of Nations mandate regime has a direct line, the mandate regime that ruled this region, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, has a direct line from that Sykes-Picot Accord of 1916. And the mandate regime, the League of Nations, and nations is not coincidental, the name nations in the title is not coincidental, was the mechanism by which Woodrow Wilson and the British and French governments devised to adjudicate the Ottoman partition, full stop. And the League of Nations was established in Geneva with this mission. And so our story moves to Switzerland now. And it has two parts. The period surrounding the Treaty of Lausanne in 1922 and 1923, and the period surrounding the crisis over Iskanderun or Hatay in 1936 and 1937. So those are the two things that I'm going to talk about. The League of Nations regime codified and enforced a new language of international claims. There was only one legitimate language in which international claims could be made, and it was the language of nations. Nothing else needed to apply. No one else was considered. If a civil servant, a petitioner, could not speak for a nation, he could not speak. There was no other categories. And so the new regime was a way to legitimate the partition of the Ottoman realms and to make sure that there would be no imperial blocks apart from the French imperial bloc and the British imperial bloc. There would be nothing other than the two imperial blocs representing the two great powers at the end of the war, and all of the many myriad of nations that would emerge and would be independent and moved around like chess pieces on a board. They would be arranged hierarchically based on identity and race and their ability to represent themselves. All Ottoman statesmen were excluded from this system because they did not represent nations. Great power sponsorship of reborn ancient nations in this region were allowed to represent themselves. And they could claim only to speak as representatives of new nations and reawakened nations and so forth. Former Ottoman elites learned this new language with some great fluency, some halting fluency, some acceptance, rejection, and so on. And as the League of Nations opened its offices in Geneva in 1920, it began to receive bags and bags full of petitions from the former Ottoman regions. Many of these petitions, I looked at thousands of them over the period of a couple months, compared the prospect of mandate rule unfavorably with Ottoman institutions. They said again and again, the things that we had are better than the things that you claim that you're bringing us. And the rule that we had under Ottoman rule was just and fair and legal, and we prefer it. And this tendency didn't stop in the 1920s. It prevailed until the 1930s and beyond in hundreds of petitions to the League of Nations. Now, prolific petition writers included the Jerusalemite patriarch of the Husseini family, Musa Kazim al-Husseini, who was at this time in 1920 67 years old and had been an Ottoman governor in a variety of Ottoman provinces, including Yemen and the Balkans and Anatolia. He was retired. Many of you will know the photograph in Walid Khalidi's great picture book of Musa Kazim. He was very elegant and tall in a fine suit and a tarbouch and a nicely trimmed beard. He's a very, very distinguished-looking gentleman at this time. And he began to write and identified himself as the legal representative of all classes and communities of the Palestinian Arab people in 1920. Another prolific petition writer was Shakib Arslan, the grandfather of Walid Jumblat, who went to Geneva and took up residence there as the representative, the secretary of the Syrian-Palestinian Congress. They went and they visited and they presented petitions, and they were denied the right to speak again and again and again. And William Rapard, the Swiss American-trained diplomat and chief of the Mandate Commission, wrote, "I cannot bring myself to feel that we are not doing our full duty towards the inhabitants of these territories, not nations, territories." That's my note. Their protests are certainly often naive and badly worded, although they were neither naive nor badly worded, in fact. But I do feel that they can make out a strong case against the way in which they have been and are being treated by France and Great Britain, as well as the League of Nations. I think that we should not forget that in the course of the war, these populations, not nations, were promised independence, and that the covenant recognizes their rights to be consulted. Now, in late 1922, all of these people I mentioned, Musa Kazim al-Husseini, Shakib Arslan, and many others from virtually all of the countries under mandate, attended a conference that took place in Lausanne. It was the Treaty of Lausanne in late 1922 until 1923. The Lausanne Treaty codified the birth of the independent Turkish Republic. Mustafa İsmet Pasha, or İsmet İnönü, was the chief negotiator for the nationalists. He went to Lausanne in November of 1922 and stayed until the conclusion of the treaty, the signing of the treaty in July of the following year. He exasperated the British delegation with his stubborn refusal to compromise. But of course, he had little reason to compromise. And his document of negotiation was the Turkish National Pact. The first article had stated that the Ottoman regions, I should say, with an Arab majority, under British or French occupation, should have their status determined by the free choice of the inhabitants by referendum. And he emphasized this position. He noted that the populations in Iraq, the Ottoman populations of Iraq and Syria, had not been consulted about their wishes, and he accused the British of coveting the oil resources of Mosul. He got in a big fight, a continual argument over months with the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon. Curzon countered by claiming that his government, the British government that is, was bound by 3 pledges. It's a sad story, but this is at least a bit comical. First, the Arab nation would not be returned to Turkish rule. Second, the government was bound by a pledge to the Arab king, Faisal that is, who he claimed was elected by the whole country. Finally, Great Britain was bound by a pledge to the League of Nations, which had assigned a mandate over the whole of Iraq. No territorial adjustments were possible without the consent of the League. He wrote, this is a direct quote, "I hope that my argument," and this is the bit that's a bit comical, I'm afraid, but in a rather bitter way, I hope that my argument will convince that it is quite impossible for my country, Great Britain, consistently with a due sense of honor, to run away from pledges it has given, to break its word before the world, to cut out the Vilayet of Mosul from the Mandate's territory and give it back to the Turkish delegation. Invocations of British honor cannot have been impressive to Ottoman citizens or ex-Ottoman citizens at the time. Now, the disagreement over Mosul was drawn out. It took months. Britain successfully framed the discussion based on the national idea. And Britain claimed that the population of Mosul was an Arab population. Consequently, it was the mandatory over the Arab populations and had the right to decide what would happen there. Ismet didn't know the new language too well yet. And so he said that the Ottomans had ruled these places for a very long time indeed. And they knew who lived there. And, but then he began gradually to get with the program and abandoned the claim to speak for the Arab populations of, or the so-called Arab populations of Mosul. He argued instead that all places with a Kurdish or Turkish-speaking population should be part of the Turkish Republic because actually people could speak Arabic and Kurdish or other languages and still be Turks. So you see, this is the process by which Ismet is adopting himself and learning a fluency in this language of international diplomacy imposed by the British government and the League of Nations. Now, there were people there from many other places, and Musa Kazım was there, and Shakib Arslan was there, and a number of other former Ottoman statesmen from these regions that were under occupation were there. And they asked Ismet what this all meant for them. And he said, it means that you're on your own. We'll do what we can. We'll ask for a referendum, but you are on your own. And this was a bitter pill that the language and the situation and the international scene had passed them by and was steamrolling them in a way. Now, after the disappointing reception in Lausanne, Shakib Arslan and Musa Kazım and the Jerusalem delegation traveled on to the League of Nations at Geneva. And they met with William Rapard, who I mentioned a moment ago, the chief of the mandatory regime. Rapard filed a report on their visit, and he wrote, "They wish to know the attitude of the League of Nations toward the Palestine Mandate under present conditions. As I had no information whatever to give on this subject, the interview must have been very disappointing to them." The efforts of the delegation to secure a reversal of the Jewish national home policy had obviously not been successful at Lausanne. The Turks had told them they would insist on some form of referendum on the Arab provinces in accordance with Article 1 of the National Pact. From the French, they had received no assurance whatsoever. The British had told them that they were very anxious not to offend the French and therefore could not entertain relations with the Syrian Palestinian delegation on account of its intimacy with discontented Syrians. The delegation seemed not to have any clear plan of action before them. So this is the untold story of the Treaty of Lausanne and the ex-Ottoman statesmen who attended and were not successful in presenting their claims. Now, about 15 years later, in 1936, George Antonius was writing his great seminal book, The Arab Awakening. The great Palestine revolt had faltered. The government, the newly independent government of Iraq, under Yassin al-Hashimi, had been overthrown in a coup. I argued earlier a British organized coup. And in 1936, the Turkish Republic had declared that the protection of an oppressed Turkish population compelled it to intervene in the Syrian north coastal province of Iskenderun, including Aleppo's historic port, in an episode that came to be called the Alexandretta Crisis. At the same time, the Peel Commission, destined to bring the first partition plan to the conflict over Palestine, began its work. The League of Nations was weakened and diminished and discredited by the various crises and contradictions at the core of its mission. And it continued, however, to endorse the increasingly perverse outcomes of the settlement of 1920. In 1937, in January, early in 1937, the logic of French colonialism, minority rights, national rights, and the League of Nations regime had turned on itself. A leftist French government, had wished to conciliate the Syrian national bloc and had allowed a Syrian treaty of independence, but the French Senate subsequently refused to ratify the treaty. The crisis in Europe was reaching a boiling point, and the question of minority rights and extraterritorial rights for minorities within Central Europe was becoming the tinderbox on which the next war would emerge. Meanwhile, in Greater Syria and Anatolia, the Sanjak of Iskandarun had remained a bastion of Ottoman cosmopolitanism. The population included sizable numbers of Arabic-speaking Orthodox Christians, Alawi Muslims, Armenian and Turkish-speaking Armenians, Kurds and Turks, and Turkish and Armenian-speaking Muslims, among Jews, Catholics, and a few Protestants. By the end of January, France had agreed to separate the Sanjak from Syria under a special joint Turkish-French mandatory regime, subject to supervision from the League of Nations, and the findings of a League-appointed committee of experts. The committee of experts proposed elections based on proportional sectarian representation, like the French mandate regime implemented in Lebanon, and designed like the French mandate regime in Lebanon by a person named Robert Decaille, who had served as the accredited representative of France for the duration of the mandate in Geneva, before which, of course, he had been the General Secretary of General Gouraud in Lebanon and Syria in 1920, and the godfather, we can say, of many of the ruling institutions of Lebanon, and some in Syria. Arab protests from Syria and from all of the mandatory countries were vigorous over the Alexandretta crisis. Shakib Arslan in Geneva organized and led a petition drive. Abdurrahman Shabander, in exile in Cairo, the Damascene politician, organized an exile opposition movement, and scores of aggrieved petitions arrived in Geneva. A group calling itself the Congress of Arab Students wrote, "People of the Arab world have not ceased since the World War to appreciate the ability of Turkish nationalists to rebuild out of a tottering empire a living and vigorous nation. We see in our neighbors what we lack in various measures, an inflexible nationalism blended with practical idealism. It grieves us, however, to say that the attitude taken lately by the Turkish government over the question of Alexandretta and Antioch arouse our anxiety and stimulates our apprehension. Least of all has it been that the country whose example we appreciate would be a source of undue vexation in the Arab world." So I'm about to conclude here. And within a year of the elections in Iskandarun, Turkey, the Turkish Republic, had annexed the Sanjak, the Sanjak of Hatay, and tens of thousands of new refugees streamed south towards Aleppo. Some officials suggested the League of Nations supervise a population exchange, but this went nowhere. The refugees were allowed to keep their property when they left. Mustafa Kemal himself had played a central role in the Alexandretta crisis, and this is where the language of the League of Nations becomes most manifest and most obvious. Kemal had fully embraced the racial and national theories that underlay the League of Nations and the new world order that had emerged in 1920. He was anxious to demonstrate to the Turkish Republican population and the world that the Turkish nation was racially pure and historically significant. Like the Maronite and French scholars of Lebanon who claimed that Maronite Christians were descended from the original Phoenicians, and other ancient nations reawakened in this period. Kamal argued that the Sanjak was the homeland of the Hittites, the forebears of the Turks, who thus had an unbroken racial connection to the region and to Iskandarun, stretching back into antiquity. But as in Lebanon or in Palestine, untangling the imperatives of international politics from racial theory was difficult. And Kamal underscored again the powerless position of the colonized population in Syria, and demonstrated to his former Ottoman compatriots that recourses to rights and promises and the international justice was meaningless and fruitless, and that only violence or the credible threat of violence received respect among states. And a few months later, at the end of 1938, he died in Istanbul at the age of 57. And so the age of exclusivist nationalism had emerged and arrived in the post-Ottoman East with a vengeance, and the lingering feelings of Ottoman unity and nostalgia finally drained away. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. I've completely forgot to keep track of time because I was taking notes. You did fine. You did wonderfully. Okay, we have time, actually ample time for questions. We end at 4:30. Okay, we have half an hour minimum for questions. We need a simultaneous translation for this gentleman.
And for you too.
And for me too, yes. God, that was so good.
I'm trying.
I'm waiting for the translation.
We need your help, Adi. I think if someone has a question.
Engin Bey?
Just one question. I'm surprised you didn't come all the way to today to the Yavuz Sultan Selim bridge. That would go neatly, perhaps, with the conclusion of Mike. So you don't have to answer the question. It may be dangerous, but I think it's important to remember these fluctuations from cosmopolitanism to this sort of exclusive nationalism. What nationalism has been doing to this, or sectarianism, nefs-i shay, sectarianism, exclusive nationalism, is a mentality with really dangerous conclusion, implications, and results. So I think, let us see if you can connect it to the bridge. Thank you.
Yes, any other questions?
Not really a question, but rather since the Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain has been invoked repeatedly, who actually gave this title to Salim? Now, according to the literature, it was Sharif of Mecca. Actually, the use of the term started as soon as the first Friday after Marj Dabiq. In the first Friday after Marj Dabiq in Halab, the Imam, and his name is cited in Ibn Tulun, called Sultan Salim Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain. Present were the sons, 3 sons of the Sharif of Mecca, but the Sharif was not there. I thought this is just in Aleppo, yes. And then as Salim moved on to Damascus, the same also, before he actually arrived to Damascus, the first Friday after Marj Dabiq, he started also to be called the Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain. So it seems to me high time that we correct the record and attribute this title or the giver of this title to the people of Aleppo and Damascus.
Perhaps I would like to make a kind of a follow-up. I mean, this is mentioned in Ottoman historiography with Hayrullah Efendi. Okay, I mean that's for the first time in Ottoman historiography, the fact that or the information that Selim's name was mentioned together with the honorific title Hadim Haramain al-Sharifain in Aleppo, in the main mosque of Aleppo, in the first Jumu'ah Friday prayer. It is mentioned for the first time in the history of Hayrullah. Previously, you don't see that.
Okay. So you consider as Salim is the first Khalifa as an Ottoman Sultan, or because there's a tradition and for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this that the scholars they explain that a Khalifa should be a Qurayshi from Quraysh tribe to be a Khalifa, and Ottomans they are not from Quraysh. So there's a book. The name is Durar al-Iman fi Asl al-Manba' Asl al-Osman. It's 500 years ago, I think so. And this Hanbali scholar, he says that the Ottomans, the origin of Ottomans are from Hijaz. So what do you, how can you say?
I mean, of course, I mean there may be a lot of there are a lot of publications which try to justify certain political claims by interesting ideological argumentations. I mean, there are also certain Turkish nationalists who claim that Prophet Muhammad is actually of Turkish origin. It's like that.
Also, I might add that Abdul Hamid claimed that he was a descendant of Noah. Yeah. Yes.
This is a question to Dr. Michael. You know, I was reading a bit about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it had the same crisis as the Ottoman Empire in terms of kind of a crisis of representation, of language, but also a crisis of political representation. What are we? And they used to call it Kakania, right? The kind of undefinable realm of the Austro-Hungarians. And when I was reading it, I was like, this is very much the late Ottoman Empire. A very cosmopolitan place, but cannot be defined. I'm not sure if there are comparative studies about these two empires and if there's something out there to be investigated more about that, because I think there is, and maybe if you can, you know, explain a bit. Thanks.
It's a great question. I will hand the microphone over to Salim Bey, who has something to say about. Wait a minute, just a second. In one moment, I will. So the difference is quite a crude difference, actually, which wasn't explicitly stated in the work of the League of Nations. So all of the post-Habsburg nations became independent, and so there's a petition which I read and can cite, you know, sort of from memory, from Shakib Arslan from about 1923, where he says, the Czechs are free, and the Poles are free, and the Bulgarians are free, and the Hungarians are free, and we are not free, and they are not more civilized or more developed or more deserving than we. So why are we not free? So this is the precise issue. And the reason was because the Ottoman state was partitioned intentionally, and in fact, part of the war itself was based on a desire to partition and to occupy and to claim the strategic Ottoman realms, I would say. So, you know, the Habsburg Empire and what happened to the Habsburg Empire and how it was treated differently by the League of Nations and in the settlement is absolutely relevant, and it's precisely the issue. But it's also the case that people, ex-Ottoman statesmen, people in the business of making these claims understood that at the time, that there was a hierarchical system, and that the double standards, the Christian peoples of the Balkans were accorded a higher degree of autonomy.
There is a book published by the Central European University in Budapest. I can't remember the title exactly now, but the editor is a man by the name of Alex Miller. And it deals precisely with this issue, comparing the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian. And if you look at the publications of the CEU, they have quite a lot of material in that regard. And there's also a book that's not bad by a man by the name of Selim Deringil, called The Well-Protected Domains. Any other questions or comments?
I want to ask Michael a question. To what degree is the Great Arab Revolt is responsible for the 400 years of Ottoman oppression?
It's a tough one. I mean, you know, I tried to already hedge this question, actually, by saying that there were many answers. And so there's many reasons why the Ottoman past became erased. And certainly the Arab Revolt and the more heroic story and the work of Antonius himself and others are part of the story. But I think, you know, what I was trying to emphasize today was that there was a language of power that people who wanted to survive, actually, simply to survive, had to learn. And that language itself was, and in a way, the Arab Revolt was part of that too. So, I mean, it's a complicated knot of stuff.
Can I just add one more thing to this? My colleague Talha Çiçek has written quite a few articles, very good ones, on the way in which the Arab Revolt, the stab in the back syndrome, was used in the 1930s in school books as a sort of way to establish this image of the Arabs as traitors and so on.
The very emotional remark. I hope you give some credit to the Arabs for not learning that language easily. I mean, at least at that point, by now, they may have learned it. And they pay a price for it. But for that time, you have to give some credit for not comprehending it for their own more general perspective.
Thank you for this this wonderful question and a very important point, which I wish to emphasize with real determination. The petitions are poignant, and they're heartbreaking, because they speak with a voice that's reasoned and based on rights and justice, and they're articulate and perfectly stated, and they take all of the things that were said and all of the things that were promised, and they enumerate them with great care, and they list carefully the Ottoman institutions that were superior and more just and more representative, and how the institutions of the colonial and mandatory state are defective and unjust, and the fact that they were disposed of unread in many cases, or not taken seriously, and yet people continued to write and continued to make this case through the decades. I think it's a very important point. So it's completely correct to make this point that they insisted again and again and again on the rights, on legitimate rights, and not to learn this language that was imposed. So. I've published some of them, but Professor Deringil said the book was out this spring. It's out next spring. So.
Oh, it says 27. Oh, sorry.
No, it's my mistake.
Yeah.
So
Sorry.
so some of them
It's not out
are in
yet.
there. Not out yet. No, a few months more.
Sorry.
No, don't worry.
So looking forward to seeing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for both presentations. I just had a question to Michael. Did I understand it correctly? You were, I think, saying İsmet Pasha at Lausanne actually made a case for that there should be at least referendum in Iraq and Syria. I mean, the Iraq part was already part of the thing, but I didn't know that it was also in Syria. Did he make that argument?
Yeah, he did. So
Then let me just then
Please.
follow up with my question.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, not that this would have ever happened, but had the Allied powers sort of said, okay, we'll create a larger, do you think İsmet Pasha would take that?
if the people of Bilad al-Sham had voted, say, to rejoin the Ottoman state, to engage in some outrageous counterfactual history, I don't know. Akshin had a story that he related to me, which I think is apropos about Yemen. So perhaps he can weigh in here.
I read somewhere, but I cannot remember the source therefore, but I read that during the conference of Lausanne, there was also a Yemeni delegation who applied for mandatory rule by Turkey, by the Anatolian government. Yeah, and also about Syria, during the War of Independence in Anatolia, there were some Kuvayi Milliye organizations in Syria who established connections with Turkey, and they wanted to be a part of Turkey, but this was rejected by the Ankara government. In 1920, 1921. Yeah.
So if the first, I think the first or second article of the National Pact is this detail. There's various versions apparently. I had my colleague Hassan Kaila has helped me with these various versions, but the first version apparently says that the Ottoman regions under occupation by Britain or France should be allowed to determine their fate by a popular referendum, and that this is and so when İsmet Pasha went to Lausanne, he made this part of his negotiating platform, but of course, it was not a priority to speak for those populations. Besides, as I pointed out, they were there in an attempt to speak for themselves, an attempt that was frustrated and prevented, but they did attend. So,
Thank you.
Abdurrahim?
Just a follow-up on this question about rapprochement between Arabs and Turks, which happened actually very early after the end of the First World War. When Faisal was still king in Damascus, he and Ataturk almost signed a treaty. There was a draft treaty and delegates of Ataturk came to Aleppo to negotiate the terms of the treaty. And the terms of the treaty would have actually recreated the Ottoman Empire, except that it would have been a decentralized, sort of a dual kingdom. And Professor Rafiq has published on this. He had the exchange and he has the terms of the treaty, which would have really undone the First World War and the Sykes-Picot and all that, and recreated a dual Ottoman-Arab empire. But this was not to be, of course.
Just to follow up to what Professor Abu Hussein has said, I mean, of course, this idea of a dual Ottoman Arab or Turkish Arab Empire, this was an idea of the Hizbullah Merkeziya, of the Beirut meeting in January 1913.
On the model, the explicit model of the Austro-Hungarian decentralized monarchy.
One little word about the Austro-Hungarians being treated more fairly. The Hungarians would very much disagree with you.
Fair enough. Yeah, it was not a triumph.
To this day, they don't forget that.
I can imagine.
Sorry, we're not supposed to have this private conversation. I keep forgetting. Any other questions or comments from the floor, please? Well, I guess it's time to say thanks, and then we have some concluding comments. That is there somebody raising the hand that I didn't see? No. Now we would have Ali Wick to make some concluding comments.